The 2020 Summer Olympics are about to start, and let me tell you why I won't be watching. The Bible never uses the phrase one world government. It never talks about a global currency. And yet, in John's apocalyptic vision that we call the book of Revelation, John in chapter 13 gives us one of the most distressing chapters in the entire Bible. In John 13, chapter 1, he talks about a beast that rises out of the ocean. This beast is called in other parts of the Bible the Antichrist. He serves the dragon, who is the malevolent, evil force behind the events of this world. When we look at John's description of this ruler, what he paints is a picture of a ruler with a vast empire. He has power and great authority that's been given to him by Satan himself. That's Revelation chapter 13, verse 2. He's being followed and receiving worship from the whole world. Chapter 13, verses 3 and 4. He has authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. Chapter 13, verse 7. From that description, it's logical to assume that this person is a leader of a one-world government, which is recognized as sovereign over all the nations of the earth. It's hard to imagine how such a thing could have happened just a few years ago. In fact, for generations, Christians who talked about a global government were ridiculed because the idea was just ridiculous. And yet, if there's anything we've learned over the course of the past year, it's that the idea of the entire globe being on the same page is not as far-fetched as we might have thought. In fact, the logical conclusion is that it's the disasters and the plagues of Revelations chapter 6 through 11 that set the stage for a generation that is willing to follow anybody that seems to provide relief from their suffering. What if a global pandemic is a trial run for a global government? A monumental crisis that allows people to give up their rights and their standing as individual nations to a single ruler who calls the shots of the whole world. Once this beast, this Antichrist, is entrenched in power, the power behind him, Satan, we're told he will move to establish absolute control in all the corners of the earth. He'll do this primarily by punishing religious belief and by controlling commerce. In fact, in Revelation chapter 13, verses 16 and 17, we're told that there's a mark that will be placed on people that will be necessary for them to buy and sell. In other words, if you're not a worshiper of the Antichrist, you will be limited as to the economic activity that you can participate in across the globe. Now, I don't want to get lost in the weeds on the details of this story. I just want to suggest that a global government isn't going to be as wonderful as the secular globalists of our day are beginning to discuss. They want us to believe that that's the answer to all the problems. If we could just eliminate borders, if we could merge currencies, if we could just consolidate leadership, the world could move together. No one would be left behind. Well, what does a global government actually look like? Well, let me suggest that you consider the International Olympic Committee. In the modern era, the IOC has been the ruling body of both summer and winter games on a regular basis over the course of the last century. What we see is an example of an organization that attempts to set policy and control a structure that covers the whole globe and instructs every individual nation on how they must function. Now, if we're going to consider this as an example, a model of what might later become a global government, let me suggest that you start looking into the IOC by Googling the phrase Olympic corruption. The fact of the matter is, there is so much corruption, so many millions of dollars that have exchanged hands underneath the table, that the entire enterprise is corrupt to its core. In fact, as much as we love to celebrate with national pride those gold medals, the reality is that there are serious allegations of event fixing in the Olympics. There are serious allegations of bribery in order to get the games to your country. There's a French corruption investigation going on right now, and the charge is that Tokyo spent $8.2 million to bribe enough votes on the International Olympic Committee to secure the games for Tokyo. That's one problem. As power and authority are centralized, it is human nature that it would be marked by corruption. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But let's also talk about what happens when you have the power over all the nations of the earth to establish policy regardless of whether those individual nations agree with it or not. Let's talk about the transgender presence in this year's Olympic Games. We know that just on the American team, there is a transgender man who goes by the name of Laurel Hubbard, who has made the U.S. Olympic team as a female weightlifter. Now, here's the problem. There is a biological female somewhere, we may not know her name. There's a biological female somewhere in America that lost her spot, her opportunity to compete in the Olympics, one she's probably trained for her entire life. She lost it because a man decided that he could get to the Olympics as a woman. Let me offer you some information about the Olympics and their policy related to this. In 2003, the Olympic Committee decided that they would move in the direction of allowing transgendered men to participate as women in the Olympics. But here were the requirements. You had to show evidence that you had had your testes removed at least 2 years before the Olympic Games in question. You had to have the legal status in your country as a female, and you had to be tested and show that your hormones were in line with normal female levels of hormones. Well, as you might expect, the idea of requiring surgery and testing for hormones led to a spate of lawsuits, and under pressure of litigation, in 2015, the 2003 policy was reviewed, and all of those requirements were ditched. So now, in order for a man to compete in the Olympics as a woman, this is the only thing that's required. You have to make a declaration of your chosen gender identity, and you're supposed to have taken testosterone suppressors for 12 months leading up to the competition. Here's the catch there. There's no testing for hormone levels, for testosterone in the Olympics. So they take your word for it that has happened. And even those who have attempted testosterone suppression, we find out now, scientifically, that those men who suppress testosterone chemically in order to compete as a woman, even with testosterone blockers, they tend to have testosterone levels 10 times the level of biological women. Well, what does that mean? It means that there's still a significant competitive advantage to being a transgendered male in a female event, and it takes the integrity of the competition into the level of tragedy. This has all been done, adopted for political reasons, without consideration of medical facts, without the science behind it all. And they've tried to lead us to think that we should be compassionate because they're really victims. For example, there was a male college hurdler, a sprinter who runs hurdles. His transgendered name is CC Telfer. Now, as a man competing at the college level, he never cracked the top 200 athletes in his sport in America. But guess what? Now he identifies as a woman, and he's become an NCAA champion at the 400-meter hurdles. This is what he says about himself. He complains that although the hurdles are lower for women, it's harder for a trans woman because being taller creates more wind resistance, and also there's less space between hurdles, which requires him to adjust his stride as someone who is over 6 feet tall. Well, CC, let me suggest, if the women's hurdles race is so uncomfortable for you, you might want to run the race that was actually designed for the body that you're walking around in. Oh, I forgot. You can't win that race. It's a political decision, not based on defending females or ensuring a level playing field for women, but on justifying access for males who assert their female identity. Here's my point. Whether it's CC Telfer running in the hurdles or Lauren Hubbard, who will probably be the oldest weightlifter in this year's Olympics on the female side, here's what you can expect. 4 years from now, if the Olympics survive, you'll see males in their prime, not those past their prime like we'll have this year. There will be males in their prime competing in women's events. If I was a woman, I would recognize that you've just been thrown under the bus, and I would give up my Olympic dream because the women's events will all be run in 4 years by men in dresses. Women's objections have been ignored and silenced. Their response has been, well, what harm does it do you if you let a trans woman be a woman? But the fact is, there's always a woman who misses out, even when we don't know her name. The Olympic Committee, because it's a global organization, is a model of what will happen on an even greater scale when mankind considers transferring itself under the authority of a single global government. This year's Olympics will have no spectators. It has given an unfair playing advantage in women's events to transgendered men, and it's all based on an underlying level of corruption that makes the entire Olympic enterprise false. Listen, I don't boycott things much. Usually I think that boycotts are an excuse for moral posturing and an exercise in economic futility. But I won't be watching the Olympics this year, and it's not a boycott. It's just that I'm no longer interested. It no longer captures my imagination like it once did. I won't be glued to my television rooting for the red, white, and blue, because the fact of the matter is the system is corrupt, the events are rigged, the competition is unfair, and there's not even anybody cheering in the stands. I've got better things to do. You say, well, if a global government is coming, why do we even fight what's on its way? Well, I'm not a big fan of Woodrow Wilson, the 28th President of the United States, but Wilson was famous for saying this: I would rather lose in a cause that will someday win than win in a cause that will someday lose. I'm on the losing side with the Olympics, and I may eventually in my lifetime be on the losing side of the establishment of a global government. But here's what I'm going to ask you to do if you're a follower of Jesus Christ. Move against the tide of culture. Stand with Jesus. The end of all things is coming. But whether we lose this battle or that battle or some other battle, standing with Jesus means we win because He wins. This is Truth Currents.